crazy weekend from the Lewis. We'll start with Lewis. I know Charles, we can almost unpick separately to that because the guy nearly won the race, and arguably we could unpack that as well. But so stark to see what Lewis said during the weekend. I mean, I'll quickly read out what he said. First of all, after qualifying, knocked out in Q1, which of course we saw twice happen in Belgium 7 days before. He said the team has no problem. You can see the car is on pole. Obviously, a reference to Charles Leclerc. They probably need to change drivers. Now, that was pretty shocking. I mean, I'll go on to the Sunday comments after, but you were there on the Saturday, and we know Lewis can be incredibly downbeat, but this must have been shocking even for you, having covered Lewis and Formula One for so long, to hear him say something so stark and so frank like that at the end.
Yeah, you get so many versions of Lewis when you're in the media and you're talking to him over a season. And this is about as low as I've seen him, even during those Mercedes days. I mean, there was Qatar last year where he was really down on himself and just, said that he's not capable of doing what he used to be able to do. But this one was clear. And actually, that last quote, they probably need to change a driver. We had about 3 or 4 people listen to it because he was mumbling a little bit and just said it kind of at the end of a sentence, just to make sure we got the quote right. And, check with other journalists as well and people who were right next to him, because we're in this scrum of journalists and it's sometimes quite hard to get a clean recording, just to check that it was. And that's what he said. So, I mean, we have seen this kind of Lewis before, but clearly there was something about this weekend. And I think it probably goes deeper than just the performance. Qualifying 12th, finishing 12th on a circuit where he's won 8 times is obviously not what Lewis Hamilton expects from himself. But there seems to be more going on beyond that. Because if you break it down and you start to make an argument for actually maybe it wasn't so bad, he was only 0.015 seconds off making Q3. And he wasn't that far behind Leclerc. I think we're talking a couple of tenths of a second, which has not been unusual this year at various circuits. So, he was really close to making Q3. And then because the conditions changed so much in Q3, wind picked up, cloud cover, all of a sudden that seemed to play to Ferrari. I reckon if he'd found those, 15 thousandths of a second, he would have been probably in contention, maybe not for pole. I don't think he was on Leclerc's level this weekend, but perhaps he would have got like a top 5, top 4. And then all of a sudden the weekend looks different, race goes differently. Although Ferrari had some problems in the race as well, but it just would have been a whole different, a different outlook. And the other thing I'd say about Lewis is that often we have seen him down and we have seen him beat himself up after sessions, especially immediately afterwards when he's in the TV pen and then he comes to us written journalists, that whatever is on his mind, he just says it. Like, he has no filter at that stage, which in some ways is great as a journalist because you want to know what the drivers are feeling in that moment. But actually in previous years, pre-pandemic, we used to talk to Lewis about 3 or 4 hours after a race, once he'd had time to go and download information with his engineers, understand what went wrong or what went right. And then we'd get a much more considered view. So I do wonder whether if we'd done those media sessions just a couple of hours later, we might have got a different Lewis. And it's always hard to know exactly how deep these troughs are. But I mean, the obvious one, which we saw before and really did take some time to come out of, was 2021 after Abu Dhabi. I don't think we're there because that was something where it was all ripped away from him. But the concern here, and this is something that you've written about, Nate, on the site, is that he's lost a bit of belief in himself. And I think that's a concern, isn't it, going forward?
That is, yeah. And I think that's what stood out. And I mean, you're right. I think the thing about how close it was, I think that was on his mind as well. And let's not forget, this was Budapest as well. He's won there 8 times. So I think if Lewis was looking at the calendar a couple of months ago, he would have circled this race, and been like, Budapest is a place I can go into the summer break and I can pull out a big result. And obviously, as we saw, Ferrari did have pace. Maybe could have won the race if things had gone differently. Certainly should have been on the podium. So that must have compounded it quite a lot as well. And then what I thought was so telling was, because you're right about Lewis, and we have covered him enough. Sometimes that and in the piece that you referenced, I wrote that Lewis his pendulum does swing. I think his good moments are great and his bad moments are really bad, and Toto Wolff even referenced that. He said, even when we were winning, and I remember we used to joke, didn't we? Lewis he'd be, 200 points ahead in the championship or something, and he'd his car would break down in Q1 and he'd come out and be like, this is the worst day of my life and stuff like that. And then he'd go and win it the next day. And part of it was almost the theatre of covering Lewis. It was that it was this roller coaster with him. And sometimes I think he's genuinely one of those guys that he does like to perform with his back against the wall a little bit. And it's one of the things that has always kind of helped him thrive. I guess it's a callback to his junior career and his rise through the ranks, etc. So I've always thought a little bit of that. What I was really surprised about was the fact that he then kind of doubled down on it on Sunday and kind of repeated it. He then, he was asked about it, and I'll read the quote again. Rachel Brooks from Sky Sports asked him about the comments. Do you feel any better? And he said, not particularly. When you have a feeling, you have a feeling. There's a lot going on in the background that's not great. Now that's interesting in itself, and like you said, I think it does speak to the fact there's more going on here. And again, like this is when I'd come back from the stag, and we had a bunch of people listening to this quote when he's like, no, I still love it. I still love the team. We were like, is he saying he still loves racing? He still loves the team. And he said, I look forward to coming back. Hopefully I will be back. Yeah. About the Dutch Grand Prix. So 3 quotes there, all of them very defeatist. And what's the most surprising to me was, obviously I was in Spa, and that was one that you missed and I was there. He came into Spa on Thursday in this defiant mood, saying, I'm not going to follow Seb Vettel and Fernando Alonso down the path of not winning a championship for Ferrari. He that was him saying, I'm writing all these documents for Ferrari, I'm doing all this work. And in the space of a fortnight, less than that, because I mean that's Thursday, and we're talking Sunday the week later, he's sounding like this. So a remarkable turnaround. And we had my brain did go back to him visiting Mercedes on the Sunday before Belgium, going back to familiar territory. You do wonder, it does just seem to me that something just has not clicked here for Lewis. It certainly hasn't on track. We've talked about him and his race engineer. The relationship doesn't seem as good as it could, but something hasn't clicked is kind of what the vibe seems to be here. And there's no other way to read into that, from those quotes, especially there's a lot going on in the background. Lewis does sometimes speak quite cryptically, but that stood out to me. And I just, if you're the biggest thing I thought, I don't want listeners to think we're just going to talk about Lewis Hamilton because you've got 2 British guys here. I'm sure people will be violently thrashing at their keyboards at us. But I just wonder, Lawrence, like if you're John Elkann and you've spent all of that money bringing Lewis Hamilton to the team, 60+ million pounds reportedly, maybe north of that with add-ons and bonuses and stuff like that. You didn't spend all that money to hear this after 14 races, did you? So you must wonder what's going through his mind seeing Lewis like that. And like you said, the point I made in the article was, fundamentally, it sounds like Lewis has lost the belief that he can win the championship for Ferrari, which there must just be red flags all over the place.
Yeah, but I suppose they would have done a bit of due diligence on Lewis. He's a very high-profile figure in the sport, and this does happen with Lewis. This does happen, at different stages in his career, and so I think with Lewis, you are getting this whole package, and you're also getting this driver who, and this was something that people at Mercedes said again and again, when he's scrabbling around in the midfield because the car's not good enough and it's not doing what he wants, it does tend to spiral downwards, or at least just not improve in the same way. When victories are on the line and it all changes slightly, then he does have this extra gear he can engage. I guess the big question right now is, can he still engage that in those kind of scenarios if the car is right? Or is this a fundamental thing where he's come up against Charles Leclerc, who we know is exceptional, especially over one lap, and he's actually realized, I can't quite match that, or I'm not sure how I'm going to match that. I need to figure out something new. And then he's got all of the changes that have happened. I mean, the way one clear thing which he's talked about is the brakes, and the way that the Ferrari uses engine braking more than the Mercedes in terms of slowing the car down. And I think he's having to relearn the way to drive. And there is no endless testing anymore in Formula One. You have to do a lot of your your testing and your understanding of the car in public eye and in races. And I think that's been quite bad. But all we have to do, and this is so true of Lewis in general, all we have to do is rewind about 3 or 4 races, and it was a different story. Lewis did appear to be making progress. There was better qualifyings versus Charles Leclerc. So I think to get kind of worked up about this one result, these single comments, it is too soon. There is now a summer break. He has a chance to reset, and it's how he comes back in Zandvoort and also Monza, which hopefully will be a big boost for him driving in front of the Italian fans. That will be telling. If we get more of the same and it continues through to the end of the year, then I think Ferrari are looking at it and say, hang on. But right now, Ferrari also have to look at themselves and say, well, we haven't exactly given this 7-time world champion, a guy who has proven again and again and again how good he is during his career. We haven't given him a car. And in fact, we haven't given any of our drivers a car to win a championship since about 2008. And so, you know, Ferrari have to look at themselves as well. I don't think they can turn around and point the finger at Lewis because, you know, that's just one of the many issues going on at Ferrari. And then just get back to that Zandvoort quote where he said, I look forward to coming back. Hopefully I will be back. The way it actually worked out, because I was kind of one person back in that scrum of media, was he was asked, but you're going to be back in Zandvoort, right? You know, just to confirm. And he said, I look forward to coming back. But he said it so quietly, the person that asked the question said, sorry, what did you say? And he said, hopefully I'll be back, yeah. So it's almost like that was just an additional bit on. And I don't know whether I don't think he meant it to sound like, oh, I might not come back, you know, or hopefully it's going to happen.
Maybe he's saying, hopefully Lewis will be back, you know, the Lewis, Lewis of old, maybe. Yeah, I get you.
And this is the thing when he gets pulled up on these things like, sorry, what did you mean by that or whatever? And he's just like, what I just said. So it's really hard sometimes to get the true meaning of what he's saying out of it. And also there will be elements which perhaps he can't help but hint up because he's frustrated, but he knows he can't go into the details of, you know, what's going on behind the scenes at Ferrari. And, you know, it may be that some of the changes he wants to be made to the car, I'm speculating here, have not been made, but he's been very clear that he's got a bunch of ideas that he wants, especially for 2026, implemented. And so, you know, that's also going on at the moment. So that's why I think, you know, you could read that there's a lot going on in the background. He could just be saying in 2026, there's a lot going on in the background and it's still not exactly to my liking, but we're getting there, you know, but he just wouldn't elaborate because he was in such a bad mood on the Sunday. Yep. So again, I mean, I want to reserve a bit of judgment here. I don't want to like, you know, really kind of go in on Lewis and Ferrari at this stage, and not least because, I mean, I think we're going to talk about this as well, but Ferrari have actually made a step. You know, you can look at Ferrari Sunday and say, didn't it all go wrong? But they had a car on pole. You know, that's not been the case at any point this year, other than the China sprint. And the rear suspension change that they made in Spa, and drivers, you know, Ferrari, I've said that it has helped. There still seems to be a fundamental issue with that car, is that they can't run it at the right height that it's happiest at, that it's producing the most performance with, without wearing out the plank, which is what happened in the Chinese Grand Prix. And that's a problem that they still seem to be solving and probably running out of time with. But there has been progress. And, you know, you look at other teams, you look at Mercedes, they've had to completely revert their suspension to an older, you know, system. So it's not, you know, it looks bad on paper. When the quotes come out, it looks really bad. You know, it's easy to get tied in on all this. But if you actually look at Ferrari's season as a whole, starting point was well below what they expected, well below, you know, what they probably should be doing. But from then, it hasn't been this kind of awful trajectory. And there have been reasons, and they are partially understood at least. So, yeah, I want to just kind of give a little bit of a, before we go like Lewis's, you know, career over, Ferrari, forget it for another however many years. I want to put a bit of block on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's wonderfully put, actually. And I think as well, like when one team dominates, like we're seeing this year, it turns the attention of the other teams up a bit, doesn't it? Because naturally, you're not fighting for wins, you're fighting for third place a lot of the time, which Ferrari are doing, and they are best of the rest. They're second position. You mentioned Charles Leclerc. Obviously, I don't want to talk just about Lewis. I think that is what has made Lewis's kind of season seem more stark, is the fact that Charles is just driving so well at the moment. That lap, I mean, we talked about me being on the Stag. We weren't in a pub that was showing it, and I looked at my phone all weekend. I was following it, and suddenly I was like, Charles on pole. I was like, what on earth? Like, you know, what happened there? You know, for that to happen, I was convinced that my app must have been broken. So it was one of those great things where when you're a bit detached from the weekend, it can almost elevate how special a lap is. You mentioned about Lewis maybe not having the feedback, or not having his feedback listened to. I certainly think it would be ridiculous and remarkable if Ferrari weren't listening to it, and you know that definitely was hinted at. Charles was also kind of hinting at the fact, and he has before, that maybe some of the suggestions he makes during the race don't get listened to. His radio during the race was quite remarkable. He then kind of rode that back. We talked a lot about post-race comments from Lewis. Charles is quite interesting. You know, when the pace just disappeared, I mean, it went from being in contention to win the race, then in contention for podium, and then suddenly kind of a distant fourth out of nowhere. In the race, it seemed like something's happened here on the setup. He's lost the sweet spot. Ferrari later pointed to a chassis issue. I mean, you've already mentioned the struggles they've had with the ride height and stuff. So, you know, those things can happen. It was frustrating watching it and coming back that Charles, as he often does, criticizes the team very, very starkly on the radio. I remember he did it in Vegas when he kind of, last year, he was very critical of Carlos Sainz. in the execution. Then he gets out of the car and he's like, oh no, it wasn't as bad as all that. And he kind of gets into PR mode a little bit. And I find that frustrating because I do wonder whether that also has hindered Charles Leclerc at Ferrari as well. Like you almost want a guy who's like, no, that's not acceptable what happened today, guys. But if there's a car issue, maybe benefit the doubt, like you said, the car has got better. What was your take on what went down? And how much do you think that issue actually hurt Charles? And how much do you think maybe they made a misstep along the way when the race was unfolding?
Yeah, I think there were multiple issues going on. So if you just take his radio transcript, it looks like he's talking maybe all about the same thing, but I think there were more things going on than just one. So in the first stint, he was talking about cuts, and that's the cutting or the clipping, as it's sometimes called, of the energy recovery system as it's putting the power back out. And that's a setting they can change. And, some people have done quite deep dives on the data, and you can see all of a sudden he's just losing out on top speed. And of course, if you're in the battle for a lead of a race and all of a sudden your top speed is, costing you several tenths of a second, you're like, what is going on? Why has this happened? Give me an answer. So that's understandable in itself. And then later on, it was quite clear that the performance of the car just completely nosedived. And there's several theories around this, and there's several theories around whether, Charles actually had a real grievance and still had it after the race, but didn't want to say it to the media. Or in fact, there was an explanation for it, or a semi-explanation that meant that he actually wrote back and didn't mean it. So he kind of hinted that perhaps there'd been a front wing flap change that he hadn't asked for. Teams are allowed to adjust the front wing flap in pit stops, and it's usually to balance the car as the fuel load goes down. So completely normal stuff. But it seemed like he initially thought they'd made a change that he hadn't asked for, and then he was saying, why have you done that? But then that seems to be part of this wider issue of the performance dropping off. Some people have linked that to tire pressures and, again, protecting the car against the ride height. I honestly don't know. Ferrari would not speak about it on Sunday, which suggests maybe there was something going on that they were either maybe not embarrassed about, but something that they didn't want to have to share with the media. And so, I think there was a little bit of an explanation to Charles after the race, and therefore he kind of held back in the media. But I was thinking about this because, again, this was a good point I think you laid out in your article, how he says one thing and then says another. But for me, it was a little bit like not that I would ever have a grievance at ESPN because, it's such a brilliant place to work. But when you have an issue at work and you discuss it with your colleagues, like round the coffee machine or whatever, and everyone's like, yeah. It's like, but when you go to write an email about it, you tone it down. And so I feel like Charles, when he's in the car speaking on team radio, that's talking around the coffee machine. And also, I think it is important that drivers are allowed to vent in that situation, because there's no point having that anger pent up inside the driver, even if they're wrong, just to have somebody at the other end be like, yes, okay, we're checking or whatever, which is a classic Ferrari phrase. And then the email phase being when you actually go and face the media and have to explain what was going on in the race, you probably tone down your language a bit and say things a little bit more diplomatically. So I don't fully hold that against him. And again, I think Ferrari will look back at this weekend and, it seemed like a victory that slips away because the pace was so good in qualifying. And again, in that first stint, Piastri literally couldn't keep up with Charles and couldn't undercut him. That suggested that the pace was in the Ferrari to win. And then for that to all disappear so quickly, that's hugely frustrating. I think that's where Leclerc's anger came from. But Ferrari must learn from that, and they must, start to have some solutions, I think, going forward.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think I'm always in two minds about Charles on that. I think that there is a degree of, you never want the email to be as colorful as your radio messages. It's just, I think it becomes increasingly difficult to, I don't want to say trust, because then you're getting into dangerous territory, but it becomes increasingly difficult to understand what's going on when you have driver clearly frustrated and clearly looks very beleaguered in the car, gets out and puts the hat on. And Charles has been with the team for so long as well. He comes across as the corporate Ferrari kid, doesn't he? He's been there from the beginning. He is Mr. Ferrari. And again, that's why Lewis's comments stand out, really, because Ferrari drivers tend to not really speak like that. Fernando Alonso used to, and it used to really, rub the press officers at the wrong way at the time. Vettel spoke out quite a lot and was kind of rebuked for that as well. So Charles does strike me more as the guy that if there is issues, he kind of maybe brings it up behind the scenes, and maybe that is the way to do it. But then the lack of transparency that you talk about as well from Ferrari, I just think it just doesn't help, and it's kind of the frustrating overarching part of Ferrari's Formula One race team, isn't it? Is that this isn't a new issue. This has been something that has been going on for quite a while at Ferrari.